Excuse me? Is your armour heat-treated? Do what? No? Okay. Cheers, mate. Do what? Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. So, today I would like to talk about this ludicrous idea of using weapons in a certain way in combat and particularly in battle. Well, you see, this video is really linked to the video where I talked about armor and my armor rant. Armor doesn't exist. If you haven't watched it, of course, link in the description below, where I was talking about the fact that you wouldn't use swords and other cutting weapons and war implements to cut armor because it just doesn't work. But today I'd like to focus on another alternative point, something that is fundamentally different in a way, but it also has to do with the same topic. So, weapons break. And I think that the best way to actually break your sword is to use it against armor. So in this video we will focus on two main points. Point number one, using swords against armor and how they would break very easily. And secondly, we will talk about using weapon against weapon and how that could be something and probably not an awful lot of soldiers would have done in medieval warfare and combat. So of course the proper usage of weapons is incredibly important, dramatically important, and because it's not like in video games or in Hollywood where you see soldiers, knights, fighters who actually willfully run towards their death and make choices that will dramatically decrease their chances of getting out alive from the battlefield, and for some reasons they just do that. For example, the classic raise of swords of villains in films that actually get them killed, which is of course something that any trained soldier wouldn't do. And with that idea, which has been used over and over again by video game makers, by filmmakers, this idea of raising your sword and in a very stupid way, in the very moment where you had basically won, you had subdued the main protagonist, the hero, and then you just needed to to thrust him and he would have been dead. But no, you need to enjoy your moment, you need to tell him everything and why you have done what you've done and whatever you're going to do and the world and how you're gonna be the new sovereign of the planet, and then you just raise your sword. I think with that, filmmakers and some video game makers have reached the sort of nadir of bad combat and bad usage of weapons, particularly from people who were supposed to know how to use them, you see. And that is the very first point I'd like to draw on this video. That, for example, I'm not saying that all medieval soldiers would have been trained or highly trained in HEMA. As a matter of fact, I think if we were to be able to go back in time and actually witness a battle in the Middle Ages, we wouldn't really find medieval soldiers using all those complicated and complex HEMA techniques, because probably they didn't even know them. That's something for the rich, something for the knights, something for sword masters, something for duelists, but I would imagine that most medieval soldiers would have used a simple concept of parry and riposte. I think that makes a lot more sense. And of course, using a shield and a weapon, then even more so. Parry and riposte. So something simple that your armies can use and that can be used in a situation of formation, because please keep in mind that medieval battles wouldn't have been just a mess of people picking up an opponent and starting to fight, but most of the times it would, and that's the same for classical times, if not even more so, there would have been just formation tactics, battle tactics, trying to overpower your opponents. So even more so, I would say that whole complex and complicated HEMA manuals and techniques would be something used either for duels or if you use them in war, and some of the techniques are absolutely viable for war, for example the murder stroke and many others. If you were a medieval knight and you were going to fight against, for example, a couple of people, of opponents who are not knights but they still have got weapons and they still have got a certain level of armor, then maybe you could have used your techniques that you know and that they haven't trained in, to overpower them, to subdue them. Having said this, so even though we do acknowledge the fact that probably the majority of soldiers would not have been highly trained in the HEMA techniques, still I think they would have been rather effective in what they were doing. They knew how to fight, particularly the experienced ones. If you are in battle and you see your friend making a mistake of perhaps raising his arms too much and getting a sword, and getting his throat slit, you're not going to do that. And even though in a situation of stress, in a situation of panic, adrenaline and everything kicking in, there might be space for error and misjudgment, but at the same time I think there are some basic concepts of combat that you would not forget in combat, because when you practice something over and over and over again, it becomes muscle memory. So it's not something that you need to think, it becomes a reflex almost. So with all this in mind, I think it becomes rather antithetical, for a lack of a better word for it, the idea of weapons such as the sword, which are not designed to cut armor, using them to slash and cut armor, not only because you're not going to achieve, as I said on that video and many other times on this channel, the what you try to achieve with your weapons, meaning wounding your opponent, but at the same time you're actually going to break the weapon. And you see, breaking the weapon, what sort of damage can a sword, for example, get? Then of course you can you can blunten the sword, and that is something that you don't want really to happen. You want it to be nice and sharp, not razor sharp, but nice and sharp. And that's one thing. But the second thing that can happen, so edge damage is something that can happen. You might break the tip. You might even, actually bend the sword. And with European swords, if they are good quality, like this is proper spring steel and it's good, like this was well made and it's nice and flexible, as you can see, so most probably this would not be easy to bend, and even meaning that it can bend but it sort of goes back in place easily. It's like a spring, hence the name. But not all swords had a high level of quality. And also, if you smash your sword against a helmet which is properly heat treated and everything, another thing you can damage is the hilt. The blade might detach itself or become loose, and that's going to be a real problem, because you need to get through the end of the battle. If you lose your weapon, you're going to be in severe troubles. So let's say that you had, for example, a polearm and a sword. So the sword being your backup weapon, and then you lose your polearm for whatever reason. Someone who is a lot stronger than you, while you were fighting, actually grabs it from the shaft and manages to pull it out of your hands because they were sweaty and you weren't wearing gloves or whatever reason, or gauntlets, and now you've lost your polearm, you managed to get your sword. What are you going to do? You definitely want to make sure that your weapon is not only you don't lose it, but also you don't break it, because if you break it, you will become completely useless. And if you can't manage to retreat or perhaps retrieve another weapon on the battlefield and the enemy manages to get to you, you are going to die. So this is definitely, sword maintenance and making sure you don't break it is very important, and it did happen. And when I mentioned Western swords, of course the counterpart being Far Eastern swords such as the katana, well, the katana suffers from this even more, because katana tend to remain bent a lot more than European swords, and that is because of the way they are constructed, the fact that the spine is soft. There are a lot of reasons for that, and I'm not saying all katana work like that, but I'm talking about the majority. So in fact, there is actually, in Japan they had a job as the katana straightener, because it was something that needed to be done. I'm not saying it happened all the time. Of course, again, it depends what you hit. If you hit metal, it might bend, and definitely you will sustain substantial edge damage. And if you hit if you don't cut properly, or you, I don't know, you crack a skull with it, you might still have problems. And that leads us to the second part of this video, the second point that I wanted to make. If you have edge against edge, which is something that happens all the time, it's sort of a cliche on films, that will, you know, sharp swords bite into each other. Now, that is the second point, because that's another thing. The way you fight, I think in Hollywood films, what we see most of the times is that they go for the bind. They have edge against edge, and then, you know, and they do that multiple times. And that is very stupid if it's done for the sake of it. So I'm not a HEMA practitioner, I'm a HEMA instructor, but this is as much as I could gather from my own research. The bind has some reasons. There are some situations in which you might want for it to happen, but in most of the times, I would say that, you know, the way they do it in films is not the sort of bind that you would see in HEMA combat. They don't use it as a way to then perform something else. Just do it for the sake of it. It's like 1, 2, 3, that sort of thing. I would say that in the majority of times, and I'm sure that Matt Easton from Scholar Gladiatoria, it will correct me if I'm saying something that makes no sense, but I think in the majority of times what you want to do is hit without being hit, making sure you sort of imagine what kind of riposte might come, and you get out as quickly as you can. Whereas, of course, in films you see many times that they don't want to hit each other, or perhaps they just, for whatever reason, they are trying to purposely hit the weapon. And again, there are, even in kendo, and I have experience in kendo, sometimes you do use the point of your sword to move the opponent shinai out of the way to then perform an attack. So there are some situations in which you can do, or perhaps using the forte of your blade against the weak of your opponent blades to use the leverage. Yes, there are some situations, but that's very different. And also, and again, parrying with the edge of your sword will damage it. So if you do it over and over and over again, then your weapon is not going to last many battles. So to reiterate and bring an end to this video, using a sword improperly doesn't only mean, like I've said in many other videos, the idea of I'm not going to wound my opponent, I'm not going to win the fight, but it also means it's going to expose you, and it also means that you're going to damage the weapon, and that can be said with any weapon, really. So when you see in films that they just, or even video games, when they just thrust the sword on the soil and perhaps hit a nice rock in the process, and in the meantime they also push with all their weight, you know, that is terrible, and you wouldn't do it with an object that is there to save your life. Alright, noble ones, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron. Now, I think I'll go lay down a little bit because I've just come back from the gym, and before that I taught quite a few lessons, and therefore I feel a little tired. Thank you for your time, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.